So let's set the stage here by talking about John and Patsy Ramsey, because right from the jump, they are central to this entire pattern we've been digging into. When you think about their posture in the aftermath of JonBenet's death, it's not just about grief or defense. It's about the way they tried to stand on trust as if it were a form of forensic currency. They were essentially saying, we are who we say we are, and that should be enough to settle this. Maybe that works at a country club or in a boardroom, but in a murder investigation, that's like trying to pay for a house with monopoly money. It might look convincing from a distance, but up close, there's nothing to cash. And if we look at how John, in particular, played this card, it gets even more layered. His line, "I know my wife, she wouldn't do that," wasn't something you could cross-examine in a lab or under a microscope. It was meant to be taken at face value, like an unshakable oath. That's interesting because it tells you he believed the weight of his conviction would carry more than physical evidence. Maybe it was arrogance, maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just the only play he felt he had. But if you've been living in a world where your word tends to be the last word, it's not hard to see how that instinct develops. Now, when we consider the psychology behind that, you've got to remember that both John and Patsy were operating from a position of social capital. They'd built reputations, cultivated influence, and lived in spaces where people were used to extending them the benefit of the doubt. What's funny about that is, in a criminal context, those very strengths can become weaknesses. Law enforcement doesn't just take your character as evidence, it tests it against hard facts. And when the facts don't line up, trust me, starts to sound less like confidence and more like a stall. There's also a philosophical element running through this whole thing. This idea that your personal certainty about someone's innocence can substitute for actual proof is a fascinating tangle of logic. It's unfalsifiable. You can't prove it wrong, but you can't prove it right either. In the world of epistemology, that's a non-starter. And in forensic science, it's even worse because the whole system is designed to operate on things that can be tested, measured, and challenged. It's almost as if John was playing a completely different game from the investigators, one that had its own private rules. So before we move into our analysis, it's worth planting this thought. What we're dealing with here is not just the Ramseys' defense strategy. It's a collision between two worlds. One is the world of personal trust, reputation, and social standing. The other is the world of criminal investigation, evidence chains, and deductive reasoning. When those two worlds collide, sparks fly, and what comes out of that is exactly the kind of dynamic we've been unpacking. Now, let's get into the layers of how and why this played out the way it did. 1. Indications of similarities and non-exclusion by experts. From the outset, the ransom note was a critical piece of evidence, and handwriting analysis quickly became a key avenue for investigation. In a 1998 interview, John Ramsey shared that his first instinct was that the perpetrator was a man, but then he wondered if it was a woman because of some of the similarities, apparently in Patsy's handwriting to the ransom note. He even noted that the ransom note seemed childish in terms of a young person, suggesting another possible interpretation of its style. The Boulder Police Department and Boulder County District Attorney's Office, as detailed in the Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit, consulted at least 6 qualified handwriting experts. While these experts did not conclusively identify Patsy Ramsey as the author, they also could not determine with 100% certainty that Patsy did not author the ransom note. The consensus among these experts was that the chances she wrote the note were very low, assigning her a score of 4.5 or a 4% on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 signifies complete elimination as the author. In a 2001 deposition, John Ramsey echoed this, stating he was told by their attorneys, police, and the district attorney that it was highly improbable that Patsy wrote this note based on their testing and our testing, but she could not be absolutely eliminated due to some similarities which exist in all of our handwriting because we have all been taught the same. Similarly, in the Burke Dr. Phil transcript, it is noted that Patsy cannot be 100% excluded, but they can't prove it's her handwriting. Another statement from that transcript indicated that Patsy Ramsey was scored at between 4 and 4.5, virtually eliminated, but they couldn't eliminate her. A December 1996 police report from the initial investigation further elaborates, stating that an analysis of Patsy Ramsey's handwriting samples showed indications which suggest that Patsy Ramsey may have written the reported ransom note. This report also highlighted the need for additional historical samples of Patsy's handwriting to make a more conclusive determination. Indeed, several sources confirm that Patsy provided numerous handwriting samples. The Ramsey updates show requests for a 4th and 5th handwriting sample in April 1997, with the 5th sample being obtained in May 1997. John Ramsey, in his book The Death of Innocence, noted that Patsy gave 5 extensive handwriting samples between January and April 1997, in addition to others obtained from her daily calendar and family scrapbooks. Okay, so let's first think about this idea of the police wrestling with what they themselves likely saw as pseudoscience and how that plays out in the real world. When we use that term here, it's not to dismiss the effort or the skill involved. It's to acknowledge that certain forensic tools, especially in the 1990s, hadn't reached the point of universal acceptance in courtrooms. Handwriting analysis is a prime example. It's part art, part science, and while it can be persuasive to a jury, it's also incredibly vulnerable to attack from a skilled defense attorney. A lawyer like Lynn Wood wouldn't just argue against a conclusion, they would dismantle the methodology itself, bringing in their own experts to frame the entire field as unreliable. Once the defense succeeds in doing that, the trial's focus shifts away from the suspect's behavior or motives and becomes a referendum on the science, pulling the entire case sideways before it even reaches the finish line. And if we really break that down further, this legal vulnerability has a psychological effect on investigators. You've got seasoned detectives who know in their gut that a certain lead is worth pursuing, but they're also balancing the reality that knowing and proving are two entirely different animals in the justice system. The human brain naturally looks for closure. It's uncomfortable to sit in that limbo. But in this situation, closure without courtroom proof. Evidence would just blow up the case. They're forced into a careful dance where they want to apply pressure on the person they suspect, but can't push so hard that the defense gets a preview of a weak spot they'll later exploit. It's a frustrating place to be, both intellectually and emotionally. Now, from a criminology standpoint, what we're really talking about is the gap between investigative truth and legal truth. Investigative truth is what the evidence suggests when viewed through the lens of probability, context, and human behavior. Legal truth is what can be demonstrated in a court of law under strict procedural and evidentiary rules. Those are two different worlds. Investigators might operate on a 70% or 80% probability threshold to guide their next steps, but juries are told to work on beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a much higher bar. So if the science in play doesn't meet that threshold, and handwriting analysis at the time rarely could, it becomes a strategic liability. What's also worth remembering is the role of Daubert and Frye standards in U.S. courts. Under Daubert, a judge decides if expert testimony is admissible based on whether the methodology is scientifically valid and reliably applied. Frye focuses more on whether the field itself is generally accepted in the relevant scientific community. Handwriting analysis has always had an awkward relationship with both. In layman's terms, imagine trying to convince a judge that your evidence comes from a machine that's only kind of accurate, depending on who's running it and what angle they're looking at. It's an uphill battle before you even get to the jury. And if we think about it from the defense perspective, their job is to generate reasonable doubt, not to prove innocence. So they would relish the chance to drag handwriting analysis into the spotlight and frame it as subjective, fallible, and even biased. A well-prepared defense can even flip this on the prosecution, suggesting that reliance on such shaky science shows the police had no real case, so they grasp at straws. That can devastate the jury's perception before the prosecution has a chance to lay out the rest of the case. In this light, the police are stuck in a paradox. The more they talk about handwriting evidence, the more they risk weakening their position, but the less they talk about it, the more they lose a potentially powerful psychological lever against their suspect. That's why this falls into the category of investigative tension, trying to use every tool in the toolbox without triggering the trap the defense will set later. It's a game of chess, not checkers. And what's funny here, though maybe ironic is the better word, is that from a public standpoint, many people see the police as either incompetent or withholding when they hesitate to use certain pieces of evidence. But from an inside perspective, it's often a calculated restraint, born from the knowledge that if they move too fast or too boldly with fragile evidence, it can backfire so hard that the entire investigation collapses. That's the kind of judgment call you don't get to make twice. So, in short, the whole pseudoscience factor isn't just about the science. It's about the legal theater that science has to survive in, and the balancing act investigators have to perform between what they believe and what they can prove in front of a jury that's been coached to be skeptical of everything. And we can continue to think about this in terms of the gap investigators were trying to bridge with corroborating credible evidence that could stand up under fire. What they needed was a companion piece to the handwriting analysis, something tangible, physical, and indisputable that would hold its ground even if the note evidence got torn to shreds in court. In criminal cases, this is sometimes called layering the evidence. You stack different types of proof, physical, testimonial, circumstantial, so that even if one layer falls, the others still hold the structure upright. The problem here was that they had a strong directional hunch pointing toward Patsy, but they didn't have that anchor piece. Without it, every layer of the case felt like it was floating, with nothing to tether it in the storm of courtroom scrutiny. Part of the difficulty is that corroborating evidence doesn't just need to exist, it needs to be airtight. For example, if there had been fingerprints on the note itself, or if the paper matched a pad in the house in a way that couldn't be explained innocently, then the note becomes far more than just a subjective handwriting call. But absent that, the prosecution is left building bridges out of string, where the defense is ready with scissors. This is why prosecutors often wait to file charges until they have more than enough to proceed. They know that charging early without that corroboration is the courtroom equivalent of walking into a gunfight with a stick. And this takes us into the psychological dimension of investigative strategy. Detectives know that suspects, especially intelligent ones with legal counsel, will stick to controlled narratives once they realize they're under suspicion. So, without hard physical evidence to force contradictions, the interviews often become cat and mouse games that circle the same ground without moving forward. In the Ramsey case, it seems investigators were trying to use the ransom note as a pressure point, but without that second piece of evidence, the pressure just wasn't enough to force a crack. There's also an underlying philosophical point about forensic framing here. In criminology, the more ambiguous your evidence, the more you invite alternative narratives. A vague footprint lets the defense suggest it could be anyone. An imprecise handwriting match lets them say it's just the examiner's opinion. Without corroboration, the suspect benefits from the fog. This is why seasoned investigators crave something that behaves like a brick in the wall. Once it's placed, it can't be moved or explained away. From a layman's perspective, think of it like trying to prove someone baked a cake without actually finding the cake or the recipe. All you have is flour on the counter and a whiff of sugar in the air. A defense attorney will say, sure, maybe someone made pancakes. You need the cake itself, or at least a pan with their fingerprints on it, before you can make the accusation stick. That's how corroborating evidence works. It eliminates innocent explanations. So the absence of that kind of solid corroboration put the investigators in a holding pattern. They could circle around the suspect, gather more context, and hope for a break. But until that anchor arrived, they were essentially trying to keep a boat steady in a choppy sea without tying it to the dock. The frustration in such moments is immense because it's not a lack of suspicion, it's a lack of proof that can't be dismantled. What might be worth noting is that the longer a case sits without that kind of hard corroboration, the more fragile the softer evidence becomes. Memories fade, physical traces degrade, and the defense's ability to paint alternative scenarios grows stronger. This time factor is something investigators are acutely aware of, which is why waiting for science to catch up feels like both a necessity and a risk. And then we can move into the reality of how the forensic limitations of the 1990s left the investigation yearning for the kind of definitive proof that would have removed all ambiguity. The analogy to ballistics is a perfect illustration. With a bullet, you can hold it under a comparison microscope and see unique striations that match it to a specific firearm. That's objective, measurable, and repeatable, exactly what courts like. Handwriting analysis, on the other hand, is interpretive, even with measurable features like slant angle or letter spacing. There's still an element of examiner judgment, and that subjectivity is what defense teams pounce on. From a technical standpoint, forensic document examination in the 1990s relied heavily on side-by-side visual comparisons. Tools like VSC could analyze ink differences, but there wasn't a standardized algorithmic way to say this is a match the way we now have with automated fingerprint identification systems or ballistic databases. That gap meant handwriting evidence lived in a twilight zone, scientific enough to guide investigation, but not bulletproof enough to guarantee conviction. And this is where the philosophical element of criminology comes into play. The standard of proof isn't just a legal barrier, it's a moral one. If you can't say with near certainty that a person committed a specific act, you're left asking whether it's right to pursue them aggressively. In some ways, the lack of definitive science protects against wrongful conviction, but it also creates the risk that the guilty go free. That's a tension every investigator has to live with. From inside the mind of the killer, the lack of conclusive science is a gift. Someone who knows the system will understand exactly which types of evidence can tie them to a crime and which ones can be contested. If they believe that a ransom note, for instance, can never be definitively linked to them, they may take greater risks in using it as part of their staging, confident that any accusation will dissolve under expert dispute in court. What's funny here is that overconfidence in the limits of forensic science can work both ways. A suspect might think they've left nothing traceable, only for advances in technology years later to expose them. But in the moment, in 1996, the state of handwriting forensics was such that a skilled defense could cast serious doubt, even if every investigator in the room believed the suspect had written the note. So the yearning for a ballistic level proof wasn't just about making the case. It was about creating an unshakable link that could survive the courtroom gauntlet. Without it, the entire investigation was built on a platform that could shift under their feet at any time, especially against the kind of legal defense the Ramseys could afford. 2. The nature of the perceived similarities and attempts at disguise. The characteristics of the ransom note's writing style were frequently analyzed and discussed. In a 1998 interview, John Ramsey expressed his personal opinion that he did not see similarities to Patsy's handwriting, describing the note's writing as sloppy and almost like child writing. He strongly contrasted this with Patsy's handwriting, which he described as very nice handwriting. In a 2001 deposition, John Ramsey further elaborated, stating, "Patsy writes very neatly. She is a feminine writer." He pointed out misspellings in the ransom note, such as business and possession, and asserted that Patsy, having graduated at the top of her class, doesn't misspell words like business and possession. He believed these misspellings were genuine errors by the author, not attempts at disguise. Burke Ramsey, in a Dr. Phil interview, also commented on the sloppiness of the ransom note, noting that his mother would always bug me about having good handwriting, and he thought the ransom note was too sloppy to be hers. However, some sources suggest that disguise was a factor. In the Burke Dr. Phil transcript, it is mentioned that the writer of the note appeared to have been a woman, and there was deception in the printing style. Certain letters were also disguised, and what sources say was an attempt to confuse police. John Ramsey, in his 2001 deposition, stated that he had been told that that was the intent for the writer to disguise their identity, but he did not know which parts of the note indicated this. In his book, The Death of Innocence, John Ramsey states that handwriting examiners believe it's nearly impossible for a person to disguise handwriting so that an expert can't link a suspect to a document, and that the longer a document is, the harder it becomes to disguise one's writing. He also notes that the ransom note was 3 pages long, and the handwriting appears to be in a disguised style. Police investigators, during their handwriting sample collections, would dictate material quickly to the Ramseys so they wouldn't have time to reflect or adjust our handwriting in any way. The note was also written with a felt tip pen, similar to the implement used to write the ransom note. A critical piece of evidence regarding the note's origin was documented in police reports. In a December 1996 supplemental police report, it was found that the ransom note was written on a pad taken from the Ramsey home. Furthermore, a page immediately preceding 3 torn-out pages in this pad had Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey written on it with what appeared to be the same felt tip pen as the ransom note, and this writing was found consistent with the ransom note handwriting. And other writing on the pad showed indications that the writer was Patsy Ramsey. Patsy Ramsey, in a 1998 interview, agreed that the tablet was from her house and that the Sharpie pen was from her house. She also confirmed that she kept many notepads around the house, especially by the kitchen telephone, where she would take messages. Okay, so let's first think about this idea of Burke's personal belief versus actual certainty, because it's really important to separate emotional loyalty from evidentiary strength. Burke's stance is basically, I don't think my mom would do that, which sounds reasonable on the surface, but really tells us more about his relationship with her than about what happened that night. This is where the psychology of familial bonds comes into play. Our brains are wired to protect those closest to us, often unconsciously filtering evidence through the lens of trust and affection. Even under questioning, a child or young adult will tend to reconstruct events in a way that protects the parent figure. In criminology, this is known as protective bias, and it's incredibly difficult to untangle from actual recollection. So right off the bat, his certainty is more of a psychological position than a factual conclusion. Now, if we think about how memory and perception work under stress, Burke's point becomes even shakier. Memory is not a perfect recording. It's more like a constantly edited manuscript. If he wasn't with his mom during the window when the note could have been written, then his opinion is less about what he knows and more about what he feels is likely. Under stress or shock, the human brain tends to over-rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts like my mom's too smart to do that or she wouldn't behave that way. But those shortcuts can be misleading, especially when they're rooted in emotional familiarity rather than empirical observation. It's also worth noting that even in adults, our reasoning about loved ones is often shaped by a cognitive phenomenon called confirmation bias. That's when we only accept information that confirms what we already believe and subconsciously reject anything that contradicts it. If Burke has spent his life seeing his mom as intelligent, refined, and incapable of criminal behavior. Then any suggestion otherwise would automatically feel incompatible with his worldview. In investigative psychology, this is why witness testimony from family members is given careful scrutiny. They're not lying necessarily, but their perspective is naturally skewed. From a philosophical criminology standpoint, this taps into the concept of subjective truth versus objective truth. Burke's subjective truth is that his mother wouldn't write that note, but objective truth doesn't care about relationships. It's grounded in evidence, forensic analysis, and probabilities. The challenge for investigators is to strip away the emotional scaffolding and ask, if we remove personal loyalty, what does the remaining evidence suggest? That's where the gap between Burke's perspective and a forensic perspective widens. And we also have to consider the dynamics of authority and interrogation here. A young witness may interpret the tone of questioning as accusatory, especially if it's about a parent, and that can make them double down on their protective instincts. In practice, this often leads to what we see here, firm statements of belief that are not based on direct knowledge. The problem is, in forensic framing, this kind of testimony can be persuasive to jurors who conflate sincerity with accuracy. There's also the physiological aspect. Stress can trigger a fight or flight reaction, which narrows focus and makes people cling to what feels safe and certain. Burke's safe ground is the image of his mother as incapable of writing that note. Once the body and brain lock into that position, it becomes much harder to entertain alternative possibilities, even hypothetically. What's interesting, too, is that loyalty-driven statements often lack the nuance that real observational testimony has. For example, a more detached witness might say, I didn't see her write it, but I can't rule it out. Burke, however, is leaning toward an absolute judgment despite having incomplete knowledge. That's the kind of overconfidence investigators look for, not to discredit someone, but to understand how much weight to give their opinion. When we take all that into account, Burke's belief functions more like character testimony than factual testimony. It may give insight into how he sees his mother, but it doesn't materially advance the investigation unless it's paired with other corroborating or contradictory evidence. And that's the pivot point where we move from personal belief into the broader forensic question. And we can continue to think about this by moving into the issue of handwriting disguise, because this is where technical forensics collides with common sense reasoning. The question isn't just would Patsy write it, but could she write it in a way that hides her identity? Investigators suspected the ransom note's block letter style was an intentional disguise. In handwriting analysis, certain features, like slant letter spacing and pressure, are hard to mask completely, but altering the style can make it more difficult to match definitively. It's similar to changing your voice. Most people can't fully erase their natural cadence, but they can obscure enough to make recognition harder. The science here is partly observational and partly statistical. Handwriting experts look for recurring patterns called individual characteristics, small quirks that tend to appear unconsciously. Even when someone is trying to disguise their writing, some of these traits bleed through. However, in the late 1990s, the methodology for identifying disguised handwriting was considered less standardized than something like ballistic matching. This is why the original paragraph framed it almost as pseudoscience, not because it was useless, but because it could be easily challenged in court by a skilled defense attorney. From a deductive reasoning standpoint, if someone was truly attempting to distance themselves from authorship, they might choose block letters because it eliminates cursive flow and personal flair. The trade-off is that this also erases many of the markers experts use to identify authorship. It's like deliberately making your fingerprints smudged. Less detail means less certainty. But in a criminal setting, uncertainty can be the difference between an indictment and a walk away. In layman's terms, think of it this way. Handwriting analysis is a lot like facial recognition. If you're wearing sunglasses, a hat, and a fake mustache, it's still technically possible for someone to identify you, but the process becomes much harder and more subjective. The more layers of disguise you add, the less confident any match will be. That's essentially what investigators were up against with the ransom note. And this is where the criminological philosophy kicks in. If Patsy did write it and disguised her writing, that suggests a calculated effort to mislead. The act of disguise itself would be a form of forensic countermeasure, meaning she wouldn't just be writing under duress, but actively strategizing to avoid detection. This is not something most people do impulsively. It implies planning, forethought, and a level of self-control under stress. There's also a psychological layer worth noting. Disguising handwriting requires a degree of cognitive multitasking. You're not just thinking about what to write, but how to write it in a way that doesn't look like you. That takes mental bandwidth, which under high stress can lead to slips, inconsistencies, or unnatural pacing. Those are the kinds of tells handwriting experts often look for. From a forensic framing angle, if the block lettering was indeed an intentional disguise, then any analysis of the note has to be filtered through that lens. It wouldn't be enough to say these letters match Patsy's. You'd have to say these letters match Patsy's even through a disguise, which is a much higher bar to clear. And that's exactly the kind of nuance that could make or break a prosecution. In addition to that, we also have to dig into the misspelling and education level contradiction, because this might be the most revealing behavioral clue in the whole note. The ransom note contains selective misspellings alongside otherwise polished, educated writing. From a common sense perspective, that's suspicious. Real lack of education tends to show up consistently across a piece of writing. You don't suddenly shift from poor spelling to sophisticated phrasing unless you're doing it on purpose. If we think about this from a criminal staging perspective, deliberate misspelling is a way to create a false persona for the author. It's a crude but sometimes effective tactic. If you want to be seen as less educated than you are, you sprinkle in mistakes. But the problem here is the ratio. Too few mistakes and too much otherwise polished writing makes the disguise obvious. It's like a person pretending to limp but forgetting to limp half the time. They give themselves away. From the standpoint of forensic linguistics, this is a red flag. Consistent patterns tell you about the writer's natural habits. Inconsistencies suggest manipulation. The education level implied by most of the ransom note points to someone with strong language skills, but the inserted misspellings appear calculated to create doubt. That's a behavioral contradiction investigators would immediately latch onto. Psychologically, this also tells us something about the mindset of the writer. If they believed misspelling a few words would be enough to throw off suspicion, it suggests they were confident in their ability to control how the note would be interpreted. That's a form of cognitive arrogance, overestimating your ability to manipulate perceptions. In layman's terms, it's like a poker player bluffing with an obvious tell. They think they're pulling it off, but an experienced opponent can see right through it. The problem is that jurors aren't always experienced opponents, so part of the defense's strategy would be to frame those misspellings as natural mistakes, while the prosecution would frame them as intentional deception. Philosophically, this creates a fascinating criminological juxtaposition. On one hand, the educated tone of the note could point towards someone like Patsy. On the other hand, the misspellings could be argued as either genuine or staged, depending on which narrative you subscribe to. It becomes a battle of which story feels more plausible, not just which is more factually supported. And finally, if we get inside the mind of the killer or the note's author, they may have seen this selective misspelling as a clever mask, not realizing how it would stand out to trained investigators. That's the danger of criminal overconfidence, the belief that a small touch will completely redirect suspicion, when in reality, it leaves behind a bigger trail. In that sense, the ransom note may be as much a psychological fingerprint as a physical one. 3. Patsy's denials and exclusion of other family members. Patsy Ramsey consistently and vehemently denied writing the ransom note. In her April 1997 interview, when directly asked, "Patsy, did you write the note?" she responded, "No, I did not write the note." She reiterated this in her June 1998 interview, stating, "I didn't put the bowl there. Okay, I did not put the bowl there. I would not do this. Said it." She further challenged the idea in a 2000 interview, asking, "Could they have fed JonBenet pineapple?" That is what I'm saying. This is weird. This is not like something I would set up or that my children would set up. John Ramsey, in his 2001 deposition, expressed absolute certainty that Patsy did not write the note, stating, "Because I know my wife. I know how much she loved JonBenet. I know how much she valued life." He even called any expert conclusion that Patsy wrote the note wrong and a serious career-limiting decision. Beyond Patsy, law enforcement and private experts also analyzed the handwriting of John and Burke Ramsey. The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit explicitly states that all 6 experts conclusively eliminated John and Burke as authors of the ransom note. This is further supported by a December 1996 search warrant affidavit, which indicates that the analysis of John Ramsey's handwriting showed indications that he did not write the note, and it was probable that Burke Ramsey did not write it. John Ramsey, in his 2001 deposition, stated that on the same 1 to 5 scale, his score for not writing the note was a 5, meaning he was fully eliminated, while Patsy was a 4.5. Both John and Patsy vehemently denied Burke's involvement as well. In a 1998 interview, Patsy asserted, "No, it wouldn't have been Burke. My child, it is unheard of." She explained that Burke loved his sister and was not raised in a family of drama, and of course I changed a word there to be more YouTube friendly. John Ramsey, when asked if Burke could have written the note, stated, "It's just the fact that that is not something that Burke would do." For starters, his handwriting is not very good either. He noted that the ransom note looked like it was written by somebody who has quite good handwriting, who can consistently write. John also believed that if someone had genuinely tried to frame them, they wouldn't have left a note at all, or they would have typed it, making it harder to trace. The existence of the handwritten note, which forensic analysis suggested did not conclusively match Patsy's handwriting, ironically served as evidence against their involvement in their perspective. Okay, so let's first think about this idea that the Ramseys seem to believe personal trust could be used almost like a legitimate form of currency in a criminal investigation. In other words, their word, rooted in who they were socially, economically, and perhaps even in their own self-image, was treated as if it could hold the same weight as physical evidence. That's fascinating from a criminological perspective, because in forensic contexts, credibility can only be built on observable, verifiable, and repeatable facts. Yet here we see an inversion of that, where credibility is expected to stand in for evidence. It's almost as though they believe their reputation insulated them from suspicion, that their good standing should be proof enough. And while in social interactions that can work, trust is often given freely in personal relationships in law enforcement, it's meaningless without something tangible to back it up. You can almost imagine investigators feeling boxed into a corner, because what do you even do with that kind of response in an evidence-driven environment? Now, if we really examine why this expectation is problematic, it comes down to the difference between relational trust and evidentiary proof. Relational trust is built through emotional familiarity, shared history, and perceived integrity. But evidentiary proof, particularly in criminal investigations, needs to be measurable, testable, and immune to bias. From a philosophical standpoint, this touches on epistemology, the study of knowledge, and what counts as justified belief. The Ramseys' position seems to assume that because they know something to be true, others should accept it without independent verification. But in the realm of forensic framing, that's exactly the type of cognitive gap that defense attorneys exploit, pointing out that personal assurances are inherently subjective. On the same topic, we should think about how this plays into the psychology of high-profile suspects. There's a known behavioral pattern in which individuals accustomed to influence and control will instinctively lean on their perceived authority or status when challenged. It's not even necessarily a conscious manipulation. It's how they've learned to navigate conflict in other arenas, like business or social circles. They're used to people accepting their assurances without digging deeper, so when that fails in a criminal context, it feels like an attack on their very identity. That defensive pivot, moving from "I didn't do it" to "how dare you not believe me," is revealing. It shifts the focus away from evidence and toward the perceived injustice of being doubted. Another related idea here is that the trust me approach inadvertently puts investigators in an adversarial position earlier than necessary. Normally, in forensic interviewing, the goal is to maintain a rapport long enough to elicit contradictions or usable information. But when a suspect skips directly to personal trust as their primary defense, they close off that channel. It's as if they've drawn a line in the sand. This is not about facts. This is about whether you respect me. That can be psychologically effective in shutting down casual inquiry, but in a criminal investigation, it just raises the stakes and often intensifies suspicion. From a deductive reasoning standpoint, the issue is that trust me leaves no testable premise. In logic, a claim must be either provable or falsifiable for it to carry weight. You can't run an experiment or collect data to prove someone's personal conviction about themselves or their spouse. And without a way to verify, the claim becomes what philosophers call an unfalsifiable proposition. It exists entirely in the realm of belief. Investigators know this, which is why they pivot back to physical or testimonial evidence that can be cross-examined. And here's where it gets interesting in terms of forensic framing. Using personal trust as a defense can actually make you appear more guilty in the absence of corroboration. This isn't about reading guilt into someone's personality. It's about how narratives are constructed in investigations. When there's a gap between the weight of the accusation and the depth of the rebuttal, the imbalance becomes conspicuous. Imagine a prosecutor framing it for a jury when, asked for proof, all they could say was "trust me." That lands differently than if someone said, "Here's where I was, here's the documentation, here's the science." What's worth noting here is the physiological underpinning of why people default to trust me under stress. When threatened, particularly in scenarios where personal identity is challenged, the brain's limbic system can override the more logical prefrontal reasoning centers. That's the fight or flight mechanism kicking in. Under duress, many people reach for the simplest, most deeply ingrained defense mechanisms, and for someone who has long relied on social capital, that means asserting trust as if it were incontrovertible fact. And if we step inside the mind of someone who might be guilty and using trust me as a defense, we see an entirely different calculus. They're betting on the emotional dissonance, the idea that you'll feel uncomfortable outright calling them a liar to their face. It's a high-risk move, but in cases where the suspect believes their public image is strong enough, it can be a calculated way to muddy the waters. In this framing, trust me isn't just a plea, it's a strategic misdirection, shifting the burden from them producing proof to you justifying your doubt. And we can continue to think about how John's reliance on his subjective knowledge of Patsy fits into this larger problem of substituting personal conviction for forensic proof. What's fascinating is that in John's mind, knowing Patsy becomes the ultimate defense because he assumes her character is incompatible with the act. But that's where logical reasoning forces us to slow down. Character is not an infallible predictor of behavior under extraordinary circumstances. Criminology is filled with examples of individuals who committed acts completely outside the expectations of their loved ones. In fact, one of the key tenets in forensic psychology is that situational pressures can override dispositional traits. This means that even someone with a long history of law-abiding behavior can act in ways that are entirely out of character when faced with extreme stress, fear, or perceived necessity. In layman's terms, you can't use "she's not that kind of person" as a bulletproof argument because the kind of person we are can shift dramatically when pushed past certain thresholds. From an investigative perspective, that's exactly why subjective knowledge needs to be separated from objective proof. Along the same lines, we should also consider that John's defense strategy hinges on a personal narrative he assumes is universally convincing. But outside of the Ramsey inner circle, those personal stories don't carry the same weight. Jurors, detectives, and the public don't have the same emotional connection, so the argument collapses when it leaves the realm of their own home. This is where the philosophical idea of shared reality becomes relevant. What feels like undeniable truth inside one's own circle can look like unfounded assertion to outsiders. Another point worth exploring is how relying on personal conviction can backfire when investigators interpret it as a refusal to engage with the facts. It's almost a form of non-cooperation, even if it's not intended that way. In interrogation theory, suspects who keep returning to character references instead of answering direct questions are often coded as evasive, whether they're guilty or not. That perception alone can steer the investigation toward deeper scrutiny. This leads into the criminological problem of self-sealing arguments. When someone insists, "I know she wouldn't do it," any counter evidence can be dismissed internally as irrelevant because it contradicts the premise. It's a closed loop that reinforces itself. And for investigators, that's a dead end. The only way out is to bypass the subjective defense entirely and return to the forensic trail. And if we dig into the possible mindset of a guilty party in this context, there's a fascinating psychological maneuver at play. By grounding the defense in personal certainty rather than disputable facts, they create a shield that can't be directly dismantled in cross-examination. You can't disprove that John believes Patsy is innocent. You can only undermine the credibility of that belief. In that way, it becomes an emotional fortress, less about convincing investigators of truth and more about preserving a unified front. And we can also think about the indignation at being doubted and how that emotional reaction plays into both perception and investigative dynamics. In some cases, indignation can be a sign of genuine frustration, an innocent person's disbelief at being accused. But in other cases, it's a performance meant to shame the accuser into backing down. In both scenarios, it's still a non-evidentiary reaction. From a logical standpoint, indignation is a rhetorical move. It appeals to the audience's sense of fairness rather than to their reason. Philosophers might liken it to an argumentum ad misericordiam or appeal to pity, except here it's an appeal to moral outrage. The idea is to make the act of doubting seem more offensive than the crime itself. It's a clever inversion because it reframes the investigators as the aggressors and the suspect as the victim. On the same topic, we might remember that indignation can also be a stalling tactic. If you spend enough time being offended at the accusation, you delay having to address the specifics of the evidence. And in a media-saturated case like this, that tactic also plays well to sympathetic audiences. Viewers who feel the accused are being unfairly hounded are less likely to focus on the factual gaps. Another related consideration is that public indignation works differently from private indignation. In public, it can be a way of signaling solidarity, John defending Patsy as a statement of unity. But behind closed doors, it can also mask internal doubts or fears. In criminological terms, this is about front stage and backstage behavior, a concept from Erving Goffman's dramaturgical theory. What's presented outwardly isn't necessarily what's happening internally. And if we put ourselves inside the mind of a guilty person here, indignation serves a dual role. It not only pushes back against the accuser, but also reinforces the self-image of innocence. The more forcefully they protest, the more they can convince themselves they're maintaining control of the narrative. It's a performance for both the audience and the self. Finally, we can note the philosophical tension between demanding trust and rejecting scrutiny. In a just system, trust is earned through evidence, not demanded as a substitute for it. The Ramseys' apparent frustration at being doubted flips that on its head, and in doing so, they reveal a deep disconnect between how they see themselves and how an investigative body is forced to see them. That's where the real collision happens, not just in the evidence, but in the competing definitions of what counts as proof. Okay, let's discuss a few things we've been circling around so far and take them a little deeper, because there are some elements here that I think are worth slowing down for. First off, this whole concept of the Ramseys trying to use trust as a kind of currency in place of hard evidence is a fascinating dynamic, not just psychologically, but from the standpoint of forensic reasoning. The way I see it, they weren't offering something that could be independently tested like fingerprints or DNA. They were offering a kind of reputational collateral. It's like going into court and saying, I don't have receipts, but I'm good for it, so just believe me. In day-to-day life, sure, we rely on that all the time. But in a criminal investigation, that has zero measurable value because the system isn't designed to take your word for it. It's designed to test your word against verifiable facts. Now, maybe what's interesting about that is the subtle assumption behind it, that their personal standing, their social capital would be enough to shield them. And when we look at this in criminological terms, that fits a pattern we often see with people who've operated for a long time in circles where their word is usually the final word. They've been in environments, business, social networks where trust and influence are actual currencies, so they're used to it working. That conditioning doesn't just vanish when they're accused of a crime. The problem is, the criminal justice system isn't built on those rules, and when someone tries to play by them, it sticks out like a neon sign to investigators. Something else to think about is the philosophical underpinning here. In epistemology, the study of knowledge, there's this idea that belief alone isn't enough. It has to be a justified true belief to count as knowledge. In the Ramsey case, the justification they seemed to offer for their belief in their own innocence wasn't evidence-based, it was identity-based. We know who we are, so you should too. That's an argument that collapses instantly outside the circle of people who already agree with you. It's not persuasive to outsiders because it's rooted in shared personal experience, not in proof that can survive scrutiny. And if we layer in forensic framing, it gets even more intriguing. Because here's the thing, when someone says, trust me in a high-stakes criminal investigation, it forces investigators to think about why they'd be bypassing the evidence-based path. Sometimes, yes, it's pure arrogance. Sometimes it's desperation. And sometimes it's a strategic deflection, especially if the person knows that the hard evidence doesn't fully exonerate them. The trust me defense buys time, muddies the waters, and, if successful, plants seeds of doubt about whether the accuser is acting in good faith. On a more technical but easy to understand level, trust me is what we call an unfalsifiable claim. That means there's no way to prove or disprove it through objective testing. In science and criminal investigation alike, unfalsifiable claims are essentially worthless for proving anything. If I say I have an invisible dragon in my garage, you can't prove me wrong, but that doesn't make it true. The same goes for, I know my wife didn't do it. You can't measure that. Statement in a lab. You can only measure whether the physical evidence supports or contradicts it. This ties directly into why investigators are trained to separate character references from factual accounts. In forensic psychology, there's an understanding that even people who are considered kind, gentle, and incapable of violence can be driven to extremes by certain triggers. That's why she's not that kind of person doesn't carry the weight people think it does. Human behavior is situational, and this is important. Criminology is full of cases where people did things absolutely no one thought they were capable of because the right set of circumstances pushed them there. Now, from a deductive reasoning angle, what's dangerous about taking someone's personal conviction as proof is that it creates a closed loop. If John says, I know Patsy wouldn't do it, any evidence that suggests she could have done it is automatically disregarded in his mind because it contradicts the starting point. That's what's called a self-sealing argument. It's immune to challenge because the conclusion is baked into the premise. In law enforcement, those arguments are red flags because they're not designed to uncover truth. They're designed to protect a belief. Something worth noting here is how this kind of reasoning plays to public perception. Outrage at being doubted, how dare you accuse me or my wife, is not just about the emotional impact, it's also a performance. In public, indignation can be a rallying tool. It frames the accuser as unfair and positions the accused as a victim of overreach. That's powerful in a media-heavy case because people watching from the outside can be swayed more by emotional cues than by the slow, boring accumulation of forensic evidence. And that's where the trust me approach has another layer. When it's paired with indignation, it can serve as a smokescreen. The more time you spend reacting to the insult of being accused, the less time you spend addressing the specifics of the case. From an interrogation strategy perspective, that's a diversion tactic, whether it's intentional or not. It shifts the frame of the conversation away from what happened to why don't you believe me? And those are two very different arenas to fight in. But here's the tricky part. Indignation isn't automatically a sign of guilt. Innocent people can and do react that way. The problem is, in investigative work, you can't hang your hat on emotional displays either way. You have to treat them as interesting but non-conclusive data points. And here's why. Under stress, our limbic system, which handles emotional responses, often overrides logical processing. That's why people can default to instinctive defenses like trust me, even when they might be better off calmly presenting facts. If we put ourselves inside the mind of a guilty person using this approach, though, the calculus changes. Now, it's not just a natural reaction, it's a gamble. The guilty party is betting that their persona, their history, and their reputation are strong enough to carry them through the gap where evidence might be weak or damaging. In effect, they're trying to make you feel that doubting them is more socially and morally costly than believing them. Philosophically, this is interesting because it's a reversal of the burden of proof. Normally, the burden is on the accuser to prove guilt, but when someone says, trust me with enough conviction, they subtly shift that burden. They make it so the doubter has to justify their doubt. In law, that's not how it works. But in the court of public opinion, that tactic can be surprisingly effective, especially when paired with strategic media appearances. Another point we should take further is how quickly this tactic burns through its usefulness in an actual investigative setting. Detectives can tolerate a certain amount of personal assertion, but once they realize they're getting no testable claims, they shift gears. At that point, the trust me defense stops protecting you and starts looking like evasiveness. And here's where forensic framing comes back into play. The very thing you use to shield yourself early on can become a bullet point in the prosecution's narrative later. It's also worth considering that this entire approach works differently depending on the audience. A jury of peers might react one way, seasoned homicide detectives will react another. Lay people might be moved by the emotional confidence. Professionals will be asking themselves, why isn't there more to this? And that gap, the difference between how two audiences receive the same statement, can make or break the way a case unfolds. What's funny about all this is that the trust me approach, which feels so strong and definitive in the moment, is actually one of the weakest defenses in the long run. Without corroborating evidence, it's just air. It might buy time, it might stir up sympathy, but it can't hold up under sustained forensic pressure. And the longer the case goes, the more obvious that becomes. Finally, if we take one last step into the psychological side of this, there's an element of identity preservation here. For someone in the Ramseys' position, admitting the possibility of guilt within their own family isn't just unthinkable. It's annihilating to the self-image they've built. So trust me isn't just for the audience. It's also for themselves. It's a mantra, a way of reinforcing the story they need to believe to keep functioning. And whether that story is true or not, that's the real power behind it. It's not about evidence, it's about survival. Coming out of that final point, we can see how this entire trust me dynamic wasn't just a quirk of personality. It was an operating principle for John and Patsy Ramsey. And maybe that's what makes it so striking. They weren't dabbling in this as a short-term tactic. They were rooted in it as a worldview. Once you realize that, the way they responded to suspicion starts to make more sense, even if it doesn't make it any more convincing from a forensic standpoint. What might be worth noting is how easily this kind of approach can work in everyday life and yet collapse in the face of professional investigation. It's almost like watching a magician pull off a trick in a living room and then try it on stage under bright lights. Suddenly the angles are wrong, the sleight of hand is exposed, and the audience isn't buying it. In the same way, trust me can feel airtight among friends, but when the evidence starts stacking up, its limits are impossible to ignore. And here's the thing, whether they were guilty or innocent, this tactic shaped the entire narrative around them. It influenced how the public saw them, how the media framed them, and how the investigation unfolded. It became the lens through which every other detail was interpreted for better or worse. That's why, in criminology, we can't just dismiss these kinds of statements as harmless fluff. They actually frame the case in ways that ripple out into every corner of it. So when we look back at the collision between personal trust and hard evidence, it's almost a textbook case in why the justice system demands one and not the other. Trust is subjective, evidence is objective, and the two don't always overlap. The Ramseys were banking on overlap. Investigators were banking on separation. That fundamental mismatch is what kept this tension alive for so long. In the end, what's funny and tragic all at once is that their greatest shield, their belief in their own credibility, was also their greatest blind spot. It's a reminder that in a case like this, surviving in the court of public opinion isn't the same thing as surviving in the court of law. And that gap between the two, that's where the truth either hides or comes roaring out. And with that being said, as always, I appreciate your support. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe if you haven't. And until next time, take care of yourself.